You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Lisa Leslie. She's an associate professor of management and organizations at New York University Stern School of Business. Leslie's research focuses on strategies for facilitating social justice and strong performance in diverse organizations. She also conducts research in related areas of cross-cultural organizational behavior and conflict management. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Lisa Leslie. Lisa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you've spent most of your career, and at least the last 10 years or so, if I have the timeline correct, really thinking about diversity. And you have a recent piece in the Academy of Management Review that looks at some of the unintended consequences of diversity programs, which has become a real hot button topic within both management scholars, but also for practitioners. So what are some of these unintended consequences, and how do you think through those?
Well, in the paper, the goal was to look at lots of different unintended consequences across different diversity practices and try to identify some commonalities. And so a key takeaway there is that regardless of what specific practices you include in a diversity initiative, whether it's diversity training versus a mentoring program versus something else, there are these 4 different general types of unintended consequences they can produce. The first one I call negative spillover. And the idea there is that a diversity initiative, instead of doing what it's supposed to do, it had some other undesirable outcome. So instead of increasing representation of minorities, the group is supposed to be helping, it might create resentment among non-minority groups, among white and men. Okay, so let's dig into that effect, and maybe we should take these one by one. So a diversity initiative is put together by a company, let's say, to increase minority representation at the senior level. How would the majority population potentially respond negatively? That would be a negative spillover. So they're varied, but at a general high level, what seems to be a fairly common reaction is that people assume that trying to increase representation of target groups and minorities means it's going to make it harder for the majority groups to be successful in the organization. Mm-hmm. They see that as really unfair. They like the organization less. They are less likely to engage in citizenship behaviors, kind of go above and beyond. And in a really extreme form, they might just leave.
And how often does that happen? Is this a commonplace response to diversity initiatives, or is it relatively rare?
Of all of these, my sense is that's probably the most common. Mm-hmm. People have this very basic tendency to see the world in a zero-sum manner. So if things are being done to help one group, the automatic assumption is that, well, this must be hurting my group. I mean, that's the basic psychology behind it. Right? You're trying to help one group that's not my group. It must be bad for my group as a result. And that's one thing.
And how would you recommend that somebody, whether it's a consultant or a manager that is concerned about negative spillover effect, how should they frame that, given that we can all understand why that would be a concern? And it seems like a certain percent of employees are going to interpret it that way. How can they frame things so that there's not the negative spillover?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And, I think at this point, there's not a ton of evidence, but I can certainly speculate. One thing I try to argue in this paper is that the sort of root causes of unintended consequences are these rather basic assumptions that people are making about what a diversity initiative means. So, for example, that majority groups are less likely to be successful. And so any way you can find to counter those perceptions can be really useful, right? So, being really explicit that, there's a tendency that when people, organizations implement a diversity initiative, people assume that means, well, we're going to hire any minority or woman we can find, regardless of whether they're qualified for the job, and they're going to get an advantage over majority group members. That's a bad policy in general. Right. So, first, don't do that, but then be really explicit to people about what the diversity practices mean. A really great way to go about it is just try to increase the diversity of the applicant pool.
Right. So there's a fundamental difference, right? So the best diversity practice would never be to lower the bar of who's coming in the door, who's going to get a seat on the bus, but to expand who has the potential to be there. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's the idea. And being explicit, because if you don't tell people that explicitly, what they assume is the former, not the latter.
Okay. There was just one line in the article that jumped out at me that deals with this that I actually did not know anything about. I might be boggling the line, but something along the lines of that it's illegal to lower the bar too much. There's something about a legal question with affirmative action. Do you remember that bit?
I don't. And so, but I mean, I can guess what you're talking about. So I should say first, I'm not a legal expert.
Wait, I found it. Here it is. Okay. All right. This is the one. Preferential treatment is illegal in the United States unless mandated by a court as a temporary remedy for past discrimination.
Yes. That is again, with the caveat that I'm not a legal scholar, that is my understanding of the law is that, and it's based on case law. And so there have been cases, Supreme Court cases and others where, sort of preference was given to a minority group member or majority group member for the sake of diversity. And in several instances, the Supreme Court has ruled that was illegal discrimination because protected groups and categories. It's not the case, for example, that women are a protected group, but rather gender is a protected class. And so what that means, discrimination on the basis of gender, regardless of who's benefiting men or women, is illegal. So,
and I know you're not a lawyer. So doesn't that stand in contrast to really any diversity hiring procedure?
So what the hiring and selection literature would say is the best way to go about it is, you have to always be basing decisions on hiring and qualifications. And the best way to go about it is to try to increase the diversity of the applicant pool. Or if you have a case where one group has lower skills than another group, providing extra training, resources, mentoring to try to equalize.
So this is just a personal experience. I did a bunch of consulting work in South Africa, and they have a thing. I don't know if you're familiar with this. They have a thing called Black economic empowerment. And of course, their history is quite different than ours. Right? They had the legacy of apartheid that only ended in 1994. And so it's a very, very different history in the United States. So they came up with Black economic empowerment. And one of the struggles of that program is that they will, and they even encourage lowering the bar for applicant pools. And they're trying to figure out the mix because on the one hand, there's been a disenfranchised people, that's 90% of the population that have been historically subjugated under white rule. And on the other hand, they have the needs of corporations and of government to be selecting the top candidates that they can get. I was curious. So I guess, and that's probably on the other end of the spectrum. It's not so much what we see here. I just wanted to see if you're familiar with that or any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was in South Africa about, I guess now 11 years ago, and I remember talking with people there about this issue. And I think in some ways it's not unlike the U.S. because, so for example, a court could issue a consent decree and decide that an organization's past history of discrimination was so egregious that for at least a temporary period in a flexible way, they have to give preference to whatever group was being discriminated against. And that's not unlike South Africa, because I think the reason for it is basically the level of discrimination was so extreme that the government has decided that they need programs like this as a way to compensate.
And in my mind, it's been a great program. I think it's been incredibly successful for them. But it comes with its externalities.
Yeah, so this is the way I personally think about it: is that without thinking about history, right? People don't really care about fairness, and so you just want to hire the best person. But at some point, you also have to think about that history, and if there's this, severe history of discrimination and other problems, well, then is it really fair not to consider race, for example? And so it just becomes this tension around, at what point does doing something that on the surface in this one personnel decision could be construed as being unjust, is that justified by a history of, extreme discrimination or wrongdoing? But there's no, it's a tricky thing. It's a balancing act.
Yeah, well, you're in a real murky area. You're in one of the hardest. I think it'd be very challenging to frame positions, and whether that's in theory or in terms of best practices in this area, in a way that there are some lower hanging fruit in other areas in management.
Yeah, I wish I had the answers.
Yeah. No, I know, but you ask great questions. Let's get back to negative spillover, because I think this is just absolutely central. So you're saying, it's best practices to articulate that it's going to be just increasing the diversity of the applicant pool, right? We do that at Washington and Lee. I'm sure you do that at NYU. Right, at any of the top universities, they're really trying to expand who applies there. You do the same thing for a company. When you frame things that way, does that still get backlash from managers?
So the evidence would say that it at least reduces it. If you don't tell people what you're doing, they assume the worst. They assume it's strong preferences for minorities, regardless of qualifications, which may or may not be true. And the more information you provide about what you're doing and make it clear that it's not strong preferences for unqualified candidates, then that at least reduces any negative spillover.
Let's turn our attention to positive spillover. So can you give a high level view of what is positive spillover?
Yeah, so it's essentially the opposite of negative spillover. So again, you're affecting some kind of outcome that's not your main focus. So the thing that you're changing is not the level of diversity in the organization, it's something else. But you're doing it in a positive direction instead of a negative direction. So an example might be, you implement a diversity initiative, regardless of whether or not it increases diversity, people actually like the organization more. They view the organization more favorably. They want to work there. They're more engaged. They're more likely to behave in ethical ways. And this is something that's there's not really much evidence for. It's very speculative, but to me, it makes a lot of sense because there is this connection where people see diversity as a moral issue. People see preventing discrimination, facilitating diversity and inclusion as a moral imperative. And there's good evidence that, sort of generally when an organization, commits to something that people see as morally important, well, that transfers to the organization. They see the organization itself as more moral. They see it as a more ethical place to work. And that has a lot of benefits, right? People are more engaged. They like the organization more. They want to work there. They're less likely to leave.
And how much do you think this would vary culturally, company by company? Right? Is this something that you would think would just pop up in certain sectors or certain areas, or is it maybe more universal?
Well, so I think that the basic logic would apply to any organization that adopts a diversity initiative, assuming that people see it as a sincere effort, right? Not just sort of window dressing and something that they're not actually putting any teeth behind. But I think it probably varies a lot by individuals, right? So certain people are more likely to interpret diversity initiatives as a signal that the organization cares about morality than others might be.
What about the percent of the segment of the population that is against diversity measures, actually are not in favor of diversity movements?
Yeah, so I think those are the people that would be more likely to react with negative spillover as opposed to positive. Yeah. I think even people who are, let's say, anti-diversity, I think if you ask them sort of point blank and certainly in public about discrimination, most people would agree that discrimination is morally wrong.
Yeah. No, I think 99% of people are gonna at least publicly say that they're against discrimination. Yeah. Some of their actual private feelings about diversity measures, if you were to corner them and talk with them off the record, I imagine you'd get some different responses.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to to the part of the paper that addresses Backfire.
Yeah, so Backfire is when another unintended and undesirable consequence, and this time you're affecting the thing you want to change, the level of diversity in the organization, but you're actually creating less diversity instead of more diversity. And there's actually a surprising amount of evidence this happens, so that organizations implement a specific diversity practice. And even when looking at the same practice, some studies show that practice increases the level of diversity in the organization, but others show it actually decreases.
What would that look like? What's an example?
Well, so some of the practical people I've looked at are things like diversity training programs, diversity performance management. So that would be where an organization includes progress towards diversity as a dimension along which managers are evaluated in their annual performance reviews. And so there are various studies that compare organizations that either do or do not have these different practices. And then they look at the level of diversity in the organization. And some of them find that when companies have these practices, the company is more diverse. But others find that actually when companies have these practices, the company is less diverse.
So company initiates a diversity training program, and then it's that they become less diverse, or they were less diverse to begin with.
Well, so some of the studies are correlational, and when they're correlational, it's hard to disentangle that. But there are studies, for example, that when a company implements, either has or doesn't have one of these diversity practices, and studies manipulate that experimentally, and then they look at the extent to which people discriminate against the target individual. And so those studies are causal, and they find that, at least sometimes diversity practices increase the level of discrimination.
And why is that? It's somewhat dumbfounding, right? That you would that a company would have discussions, whether that's about implicit bias. You can imagine, right? These things are like a half-day training on diversity, on diversity, and then they end up worse for the weather.
Yeah. So I think what the most common mechanism is that a basic thing that these diversity practices do when you implement them, it signals that target group members, whether it's women or minorities, need extra help to be successful in the organization. We know the reason why they need extra help is because of these systematic barriers and discrimination that exist in the society. But people have a tendency to ignore those situational explanations and focus more on individual explanations. So basically what happens is, you have these policies, people say, oh, these groups need more help to be successful here. Oh, they must not be very competent. We shouldn't hire them.
Okay.
So I think that's the most common one. There's also some evidence, though, that there can be what's called a licensing type effect, which is basically, okay, a company has a diversity practice. They must really care about this issue. Therefore, we don't have to worry about bias and discrimination right here. I'm just not even going to pay attention to whether or not it's happening. It kind of reduces people's vigilance, which can also increase bias and discrimination.
That's like when people they did a study that was looking at the effects of seatbelts, and it was an easy study because seatbelts were really not around, and then all of a sudden they were mandated in cars, and found that people drove more recklessly because they had this false sense of security, or maybe not false sense, but they had a sense of security with their seatbelt, and they felt like they could take on more risk.
Yeah, we're safe. Therefore, we can be riskier. Yeah.
So is that the kind of thinking? Like we have a diversity program. We are implementing this. So now it's there. All right, guys, look, it's here. So we can go move on to other things.
That's right. We don't have to be careful about it. We don't have to think about our decisions. Right.
And so what's a way that a company can implement a diversity training program and avoid these negative effects?
Yeah, so I think with the first one I talked about, where it can stereotype target group members as incompetent, I think it's important to highlight why it is that certain groups need extra help. Why you need diversity programs? It's because some people are more likely than others to face these pervasive problems, and it's a way to counteract those. It's not because those individuals are personally incompetent. With the sort of vigilance or licensing type effect, where people just are less, aware of the possibility of discrimination, I think it's a little trickier. But accountability might be one way to get around that. Or even just making that part of the message, that this is something we're doing. It's an issue we care about, but, it's not enough just to have this practice. We all need to be vigilant and keep each other accountable for the kinds of decisions.
Is there any difference between companies that do this over as a one-time shot, right, a 4-hour afternoon, versus ones that do it over the course of 2 years with, several iterations on different topics that deal with diversity?
Yeah, I don't know if that's been systematically studied, but I have a very strong intuition that the companies that do this as a one-off are not going to make any progress. I mean, it's the kind of it's really a societal problem, right?
Yeah.
Where we have problems with discrimination in society. They start from day one. It's very difficult for organizations to counteract them once people are adults, and so it's not a one-time quick fix. We solve the problem. It's got to be a sustained effort if you want to move the needle.
We'll turn to the last on your 4-quadrant grid that kind of outlines your paper. Can you go through false progress?
Yeah, so false progress is the idea that a diversity initiative looks like it does what it's supposed to do. So you implement this initiative and the diversity numbers get better. But the reason why it's an unintended consequence is that nothing has really changed. So essentially, the diversity metrics now look better, but there hasn't been any true progress made toward diversity goals. So something that people have speculated that might happen is, let's say an organization wants to increase representation of women and minorities in managerial positions. They have a certain type of job that has a lot of women and a lot of minorities. It typically has not been it's not truly a managerial job, but they just kind of reclassify it and say, okay, everyone in this job, you're a manager, right? So it looks like now the number of minorities in managed positions has gone up dramatically, but nothing has really changed.
Okay. So, so it's almost like either lip service would be a generous statement, and then maybe a more honest one would be they're just deceiving the company. Like it's just retitling things for the purpose of deception.
So that example is very deceptive, but I could give you another example that's I don't think it has to occur through deception. So I have a paper from a few years ago where I find that having a diversity initiative creates a pay premium for high potential women such that they're paid more than high potential men. So in organizations, most women earn less than men, but among this select of high potential women, they're already either in very high level positions or have been deemed sort of as likely to get there. They actually get paid more than the men. And the basic idea is that, when you have a diversity initiative, the company cares about diversity in the organization. Most managerial positions are actually pretty diverse, but that's not true at the highest levels. So there's particular demands, particular value for these high potential women, which pushes up their price essentially. It's a supply and demand type argument. But I argue that's an example of false progress, because what the diversity initiative is doing is that overall it's reducing the gender gap. So the gender gap between men and women on average is going to be smaller if certain women are getting this premium as compared to when they're not. But it's not really working the way a diversity initiative is supposed to work, right? Ideally, the initiative would create equitable pay for everyone, regardless of their potential, between men and women. And instead, what it's doing is most women who are not high potential are still being underpaid, and it's only this very select group of women that are being overpaid. So if you just look at the average, does the diversity initiative reduce the pay gap? Yes, it does, but it's not really doing it in the way that ideally it would be working.
That's really interesting. And was this study done on a single company, or who was your population?
So we found evidence for this. It's one of the most robust things I've ever studied. We found it in different studies. So one was just one organization where we had information on people's gender, their performance ratings, and their pay. Yeah. We did 2 laboratory studies where we manipulated gender and potential and looked at people's perceptions and how much they would pay them. And we also did among the sort of highest paid executives in I think it's the S&P 1500. We used some existing data, and we found it there too across companies.
And what could a company do to make this where it's more equitable?
So I think what it suggests, when I talk about that specific finding, people have very different reactions to it. Some people say, this is great. We need these high paid women in senior level positions are going to be a role model and, lead to sort of further shattering the glass ceiling. But then people say, well, this is pay discrimination against high potential men. So I'm agnostic. I'm just the researcher trying to reveal what's going on out there. But I think what it suggests is you can't look at overall pay gap. You need to, if you're a company, you need to be attentive to, what's happening among low potentials, moderate, and high, right? Sort of section out the data that way to make sure that you're not hiding more complicated patterns with what's going on.
There's been a lot of attention in Silicon Valley, especially about our big tech firms and their diversity initiatives, and this is both for women hires as well as for minorities. There's such a white male culture. Is there anything that you've seen there that you think that has been effective, or that would maybe represent a best practice? And maybe on the flip side, are there initiatives that you've seen that you are more concerned about?
Yeah, it's hard to know because often, companies will announce an initiative and you don't really know what's going on unless you're in the company. But yeah, I'd say, in general, initiatives are going to be more successful when they're, they have buy-in at the top, that it's not just the HR department pushing it, but the senior leadership on board. They're more extensive, and there's an understanding that it's not a quick fix, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take sustained effort.
Can you talk a little bit about your work on diversity rhetoric coming from leaders, how leaders discuss diversity and what the effects are of that?
Yes, that's actually it's an ongoing project. Still working on these to gather some more evidence, do some more studies, but something I'm really excited about, because thinking about all of the different unintended consequences of diversity initiatives, it gets really complicated. And it's not clear there's one easy, quick fix. And so what some of my co-authors started thinking about is, well, are there relatively simple things that leaders could do to make these initiatives more effective? And something I just noticed over the years is that whenever you talk to leaders in organizations and they talk about their initiatives and how they try to sell them, the message they always come back to is this idea that diversity is valuable, right? It's the right thing to do, not only, but also, and what they emphasize even more, is that it's good for business, right? Organizations that are diverse perform better.
And is that true?
No, it's not. On average, the standalone statement, it's not, which I know is shocking.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of research on this. And overall, if you look at the level of diversity in a work team or an organization and how well they perform, the relationship is basically essentially zero, right? The level of diversity tells you nothing about how well they perform. But what's important about that is that it masks a lot of variability, right? So in some studies, under the right conditions, yes, diversity is absolutely beneficial, right? Diverse organizations perform better than those that are not. But then in other conditions, it's not. It's worse, right? So we know that people often don't like each other who like other people who aren't like them. It creates conflict, it creates tension, and it actually hurts the organization. So what the reality of diversity in organizations is, yes, diversity can be beneficial, but only if you're very thoughtful about creating the right kind of conditions where you can minimize unproductive conflict and really leverage the benefits of diversity.
Okay, and how would you minimize that kind of conflict?
Well, it's things like creating the right kind of conflict, the right kind of climate, getting people to understand that there can be value in diversity if you're willing to work through it. It's things like getting people to engage in perspective taking, right? Think what things might be like from someone else's perspective. And so what my collaborators and I have been doing is looking at how leaders talk about diversity and whether they give this sort of uniform, yes, diversity is good, diversity is bad, versus diversity is bad message, or whether they give this more nuanced and realistic message that, like, yes, diversity can be good, but we all have to work really hard at it. And what we find is that kind of message is much more motivating. People are more willing to support diversity initiatives and personally work harder towards diversity and inclusion when leaders give this both more nuanced but also more realistic message around diversity and organization.
And are there leaders that take a nuanced approach? And I ask that just because most of the things that you see out there, especially in the popular press, just assumes that diversity is a strong strategy, both morally as well as for performance. And given that, I'm pretty sure that that's what's in the zeitgeist. So are leaders able, do you find leaders that do take a nuanced perspective?
Yeah, so there's a massive science practitioner gap on this issue. So we've looked at this a couple different ways. One was just to code diversity websites of different companies and see how they talk about it. And they're always find is diversity is good, diversity is good, diversity is good. We've also done a couple surveys using different populations where just ask people, how does your leader talk about diversity and to what extent they use these different rhetorical styles. And still the idea of diversity is good is the most common, but the contingent view, the more nuanced view that's only good if you work hard, it's actually more common than we would expect. It's sort of more, people sort of slightly agree that leaders on average talk about diversity that way. They strongly agree they talk about diversity is good. They also sort of slightly agree that leaders use this more nuanced messaging. So I find that encouraging. I think people know it. I think most people know that diversity is both good and hard.
Are there any methods from a recruiting standpoint, which is the part that gets the most attention for diversity, that you think would qualify as a best practice? I mean, we've talked a little bit about how that gets communicated, but are there any practices in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, and it probably depends on the specific job and industry. Because, different groups tend to be underrepresented in different contexts. But in general, I'd say just, to the extent that you use as many different methods as possible, whether it's sort of formal advertisements, reaching out to advocacy groups, using people's personal networks. So the more of those you use to try to get as much diversity in the pool as possible, the better off you're going to be.
All right. I think we're about out of time. Are there any closing thoughts or other things you want to make sure that we get to?
I would just say that, diversity is hard. It's complicated. It doesn't always work like it's supposed to, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.